best part of it was I was within walking distance of my cousin. In those years, you lived way up there, and your carriage was way down in the basement. They had these big, heavy carriages, and I would have to pull it up. It was terrible. But you wanted your baby to have fresh air. So I would walk over to Mildred, take the elevator up to her apartment. The baby would have lunch there. Then the two of us and the baby would go out and spend the whole afternoon doing all kinds of neat things.
Toby was in school?
Toby was in school. And then we'd be sure to be back, when Toby would get out of school. She always wanted to wheel the baby carriage. And I moved to Baltimore when my baby was 9 months old. I can still see us sitting out there. And Mildred was almost in tears at the thought of me moving. I was in tears too, because I didn't want to lose this family, The next thing I know, Mildred's pregnant. And she told me it was because whenever she would babysit for Barry, which wasn't that often, but she did. And of course we were together every day, so she used to feed him, diaper him, and all that. And she wanted to, not that she had, but she wanted to. And she told me that she just yearned for a baby. And that baby was Susan. Beautiful Susan.
And it was a difficult delivery for her.
Very, very, very difficult. And I didn't know this at the time. I didn't find this out until I came to see her after the baby was born. That Sam wasn't even there.
Mm-hmm.
I was absolutely appalled.
And how complicated was the birth?
From what she told me, it was quite complicated.
And then did she have, when she came home, who helped her out if she was so ill?
That I don't know. That is a very good question, and I don't remember the answer to that.
I think it might have been Evelyn's mother.
I wouldn't be a bit surprised.
Aunt Paula. She was very close to her.
Yes, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if it was Paula.
Yeah.
That sounds very logical.
And at that time, they still lived on Leland Avenue?
Yeah.
And they stayed there until...
No.
They were already in Parkchester?
No. At that time, they lived, when you were born, that was Parkchester.
That was Parkchester
sure.
already. So she left Leland Avenue soon after you did?
No, she left Leland Avenue before I did.
Oh.
She lived in Parkchester when I lived on Leland Avenue.
I
That's
see.
what I say. I used to walk
Oh.
over to her house, and it was great because she had an elevator. I didn't have to pull that carriage up or the baby or anything.
I see. So you used to walk in Parkchester.
Oh, sure. It was wonderful because unless it rained, I was there. If it rained, I couldn't walk the baby there, but other than that.
And her father, where was he now?
He was
during
married
these
to
years.
Greta. And they lived in Coney Island, or Brighton Beach.
How did he come to live in Coney Island?
They didn't live in Coney Island, lived in Brighton Beach.
Yeah.
Because when he met her, she lived in Brooklyn. She was always a Brooklyn lady.
How did he meet her?
It was an arranged
Oh, really?
An arranged meeting. Somebody called him and told him about this wonderful lady who was a widow. And they called her and told her about this wonderful man who's a widower. And he called her. They got together, liked each other very much, and from that started. But when he married her, they were still living in Parkchester. I mean, in Pelham Parkway.
On Leland Avenue.
No, Pelham Parkway.
Oh, with
when
the,
he met
yeah.
her, he was living with Mildred.
I see.
He and Jerry were living with Mildred.
Right.
And then when they
So it was soon after his wife had died.
Oh, no, it wasn't
No?
soon after. Not really. It was a couple of years. Because I think it was more. I think it was close to 4 years. Because
Oh.
don't forget, Toby was born in the meantime.
That's
and
right.
all of that, he continued living on Prospect Avenue with Jerry and Jack for several years.
Oh, I thought they moved immediately.
No, then when Toby was born,
Yeah.
Toby felt so sorry for them. She felt like they weren't getting the proper meals, that it was very difficult on her father to take care of. He was taking care of Jack's laundry and Jack's meals and Jerry's and, So she talked with Sam, and then she talked with them.
Now let's talk a little bit about the ancestors in the old country, about grandfather Harry's parents, your Uncle Heschel.
Well, my mother always spoke of, in Yiddish, the expression is in the heim, which means in the home, which means in the homeland. And they talked about that, kept comparing, making comparisons, and I got the complete picture that they had their own home. My grandmother had married an older man who had already pretty much grown children, teenagers, one son who was very much my grandmother's age when my grandmother was taken to meet him. This was a matchmaker's arrangement. And her mother urged her and convinced her to marry this man. He had his own business. He was a cap maker. That's very important in Russia because the climate there is very severe, so that they had these fur hats, and in the summer they always wore caps. So it was a very good, thriving business. And they lived in back of the shop. They had quite a nice property, quite a bit of land, so that the house went all the way back, and there was plenty of room for everyone. But my mother did tell me that in the wintertime, they slept on top of ovens that the embers were allowed to cool a little bit, but it was nice and warm. And they had the feather quilts, and that's where they would sleep in the winter, because certainly they had no central heating. And she used to say it was so wonderful to snuggle up like that in there. And it isn't as though one person slept on this thing. 2 or 3 kids would get into that. In the basement, no, it was not a basement. It was next door to the house. They had an underground cellar. The doors opened up right from the ground this way. And my mother said everything would be so well preserved there all summer long. They had a garden, and my grandmother used to tell me about the wonderful rose jelly that she made. They would go out and pick the wild roses, and she had all the vegetables that she would grow, all her food that she grew, all the vegetables and everything, so that all winter long they would have that.
Were they considered well-off people?
They would be considered not well off, but comfortable. I mean, they never had a lack of food. They never suffered from a lack of food, which was always a concern of many of the Jewish people. Making a living was of utmost importance for the Jewish people, for survival. And so that was always, in Yiddish, they say.
Tell me about
I want to say something. When my grandfather died,
Right, I was just going to ask you about that.
they were left, my grandmother tried to hire to run the business by keeping employed the cap maker who had been working with my grandfather. It didn't work out. She had no way of controlling the worker there, and it just didn't work out. So there she was with 6 children. There certainly was no Jewish charities there. There was no welfare. The state did not provide welfare. She had to do the providing. So if anybody ever saw Fiddler on the Roof with Tevye and his horse and cart, my grandmother became the horse. She would get that cart, get up very, very early in the morning to be at the farm houses. How far away, I never could gauge mileage from the way she spoke, but it took her a good half hour or 3/4 of an hour to get to the first farmhouse. There she would get milk. Maybe she had to go further down the road for eggs, butter, cheese, so it went. Chickens, live chickens she would have in the cart, cage them. And then she'd have to come back into town. She had her steady customers. She would go from door to door wherever they lived and sell all her produce, all her goods. And of course in the summer there was also vegetables that she would bring back and things that they grew on the farms. And this was her way of earning a living. The house that they lived in was totally paid for. It was their house. So that they didn't have a concern about. But there was clothing, there was food. If one got sick, you had to go see a doctor. They did have doctors, of course. And I know that my mother went to work at age 8 in a factory. My mother tells me, that surprised me totally, that under the Tsar, they had a child labor law. And she tells me periodically the investigators would come in. Most of the time, they already knew when they were coming. So my mother said they had a box that all the kids would stand on. I don't know about all. I have no idea really how many worked there, but she told me she would get up on the box. And that always struck me as so absurd, that they couldn't tell a child from
Just
an
because
adult.
they were bigger, yeah.
Just because they were
Standing
on the
tall.
box taller, And in sequence, my Uncle Aaron was the oldest. No, my Tante Cyril was the oldest. Then came my Uncle Aaron, whom of course I never knew, because I think I had mentioned earlier that he had died.
Right.
Then came my mother, and immediately after my mother came Malka. No, Malka was older than my mother. Then came Malka, then my mother, then Herzl, and then Coleman, whom we used to call Charlie. But their Hebrew names were Aaron, Cyril, no, Cyril came first, then Aaron, then I think my mother came. My mother's name was Leah, and then came Herschel. Sorry. It was Aaron, Cyril, Malka, Leah, who was my mother, then Herschel, who was your grandfather, and then Coleman. He was the youngest. I'm sure if my grandfather had continued to live his long life, that there would have been more children.
How old was he when he died?
They told me about 65.
And at that point, your grandmother was?
At that point, my grandmother must have been about maybe 40.
So when he died, the youngest child was how old?
When he died, I don't know. I don't know how old my mother was when her father died, but she must have been quite very little, because if she had to go to work at 8 years old.
It was probably close to that,
So, yeah,
maybe
probably,
6 or 7.
probably so.
And how old was she when she left Russia?
How old was who?
Your mother.
My mother was about 18, I think, when she arrived.
So she remained 10 years after she began to work.
Yeah,
And then your grandmother came over how many years after your mother?
the following year.
The following year.
She had, oh, I must tell this story. My grandmother told me this story, that she used to go to the farms to buy all the goods, to bring back, all the farm products to bring back to sell. And she used to bargain, and they were always very agreeable to settle, maybe half and half, so that they came to an agreement. One day, she came to buy the produce and started saying, "This is a little too high." And the farmer laughed, and he said, "What do you have to save your money for? What are you worried about? You're not going to be here, you're not going to be living here much longer," something like that, with an evil laugh, It wasn't, there was nothing friendly about it, it was evil. Of course, they were accustomed to hearing about pogroms and always living in fear of it.
The what?
Pogrom.
What is that?
A pogrom, P-O-G-R-O-M, never heard of a pogrom? That was when the Cossacks would come riding in on their horses. And of course, they always came in a large group with their sabers and their guns, and start shooting everyone they saw, then come into the houses, rape all the women, young girls, kill boys, young boys, and just rape and pillage an entire village.
And so your grandmother was very frightened of this.
Very frightened when she began to hear these rumbles going on in the farms, And she came home one day and she said, "Children, it's time to go to America." And the first to leave was my Tante Cyril and her husband Joseph and little Jacob, who was 4 years old at the time. They had been saving for their own money, because then my grandmother was saving as much as she could, and of course everybody worked, and when they got enough of passage, the following year, after my Tante Cyril came to America, they came. I mentioned that before. That was your grandfather, my mother, Malka, and her fiance, all came to at the same time. My mother said it was a horrendous, horrible trip, because they were way down in the, I forget what that's called, that part of the boat. And she said that everybody was so seasick, because that's where you feel the full impact, right down there, when the boat begins to shake and rock and the waves get at it. Just everybody vomiting, and the toilet facilities were horrible. And she said it was just horrible. Steerage, that's what that is. During the day, they were allowed to come on the lower deck to get some fresh air, and sometimes they'd go to sleep out there, but they couldn't come up into the first passenger areas. And finally, they landed in Ellis Island and just hoped and prayed that they weren't going to be rejected for one thing or another. And that left my grandmother, my grandmother Goldie, and Coleman, whom we later called Charlie, whom he called himself Charlie later, to sell the house. That would give them money for passage and some money with which to travel and to have in New York. And they joined them a year later.
Now you mentioned my mother and my father moved in with my father's parents upon their marriage. What are your recollections about my father's parents?
Your grandfather was a very handsome man, and I liked him a lot. He was always also dressed very nicely. And your grandmother was a very motherly, very loving kind of woman, always baking and cooking. The minute, I would come every Saturday to visit, or no, I worked Saturdays, I'd come every Sunday to visit. And Saturday evening after work, if I went out on a date, your mother and father, my date and I, another couple, we'd always go together. But I would come up there and immediately, are you hungry? How about a cup of tea? In those years it wasn't coffee, it was tea. How about a cup of tea? How about I just baked something good, you're gonna like it, that kind of thing. You felt very warm and very welcome there.
Did my mother enjoy living there?
Yes, your mother really loved her. She really loved her. And your aunt, Blanche, at the time was younger than I. She seemed very standoffish. I hardly even got a hello from her. She seemed to be in her own world almost. She was a teenager, I guess, and you know how they are.
Yeah.
Your Uncle Harry, I very rarely saw there when I was there. I guess he was out on the town himself, George, of course, was a kid, a very lovable kid, very good-looking child, and very friendly, very nice. It was a nice house to come to. Comfortable, very nice. Your parents had their own room. I can't remember if this apartment that they lived in also had 2 baths, but I have a feeling it must have, because they had those kind of apartments. They're very spacious, big rooms. And I think it was a private bath, a full private bath in the master bedroom. And then, of course, there was one, in the hallway for everyone to use. So it was a very comfortable, very nice home, nicely furnished, and in a nice part of the Bronx.
That was Pelham Parkway?
Yep,
Yeah.
that was Pelham Parkway.
And they remained there for how long?
They were there for, I'm trying to remember, but I think about 3 years.
And at that point, my mother and father took in Heschel?
No, not at that point, no. After that, your parents had saved enough money to get into their own apartment. And that's when they moved to Leland Avenue.
I see.
And that's when they got their little apartment and furnished it beautifully, very nice. And they lived there. Toby was born there. And it wasn't until about 4 years after her mother's death that the decision was made to get a large apartment very close to where your grandparents were living, in the Pelham Parkway area, and to take care. She wanted to be able to take care of her father and her brothers. It was, she just felt very concerned about them all, and she loved them all dearly. Your grandfather was a wonderful, wonderful, caring father. He was wonderful to his children, and they loved him dearly, felt very close to him. And so that's what they did. And that's when Toby at the time was, I don't know, maybe a year old, maybe a year old. I can remember your grandfather complaining that, how can you let a baby cry? You know, he couldn't stand it to hear Toby cry for anything. And I also remember they came to visit us once, your mother and Toby and your father. And I was not married yet, I was still living at home. No, I was married then. I was married, but I was also visiting. We were all visiting there together. And Toby started to cry. She was younger than a year then. So my grandmother said, the baby's hungry. And your mother said, oh no, I can't feed her now. She's looking at the time. She said, she still has a half hour to go. So my grandmother looked at her. She says, a half hour? What do you mean a half hour? She said, oh, the doctor said only every 4 hours. My grandmother was furious. She said, does the doctor eat when he's hungry? What do you mean you're gonna let that baby cry for a half hour when she's hungry? She said, I raised 6 children at the breast. When they cried, they got my breast. She said, she was outraged. Toby warmed up the bottle and sat down and fed her. I mean, Mildred warmed up the bottle and sat down and fed her. Because my grandmother was outraged at this behavior. Of course, she was right. You know, we found out later. And my grandmother was a very wise lady.
This is Goldie.
Goldie. I used to, she always used to talk about her children, you know, loved her children dearly, but especially she would talk about Aaron and Malka. And one day I said something to her.
What happened to Aaron and Malka?
I think I mentioned it, that Aaron went to another village in his Tsarist uniform, the Russian army uniform, in which I saw his picture. Oh, gorgeous guy, gorgeous hunk of man. And he was going there to meet, it was a shidduch. A shidduch is where a matchmaker decides that 2 people ought to get together.
Right.
And this was in another village, another area. Although Pskov wasn't a village, really. Pskov was really a small town surrounded by farmland. But it was a good-sized little town. And I think I also mentioned that was the town John Malechin came from. That's
right.
Where he was born. That was his home. Anyhow, so I said to her,
so he went to another town and he was killed?
He went to another town with his uncle. His uncle accompanied him. His father
to meet this girl.
To meet this young lady, this girl. And after they had dinner and they seemed to really like each other a lot, he spent like 3 days there. And he got an appendix attack.
Oh, yeah.
And there was just no way that he could. Malka died of diphtheria during the epidemic.
Yes.
Left a 1.5-year-old baby. And I think I had talked about that.
Right. And so your grandmother said she
So
always.
I said to my grandmother, I said, Baba, I said, yeah, every time you talk, and of course I always spoke to her in Yiddish, every time you talk about your children, you always talk about more than any of your other children. You talk about Agna Malka. I said, you don't talk that much about your other children. So she looked at me and she said, show me your hand. And I showed her my hand. And she said, she took away 2 fingers like this. And she says, if you lost these 2 fingers, you wouldn't even think about the 3 you have. You would only look at these 2 stubs and say, oh, if I only had these 2 fingers back, what I could do with this hand, you know. That brought the whole thing into perspective.
Right.
And she would always do things like that. She was able to, I can only call it being wise, you know. She was able to explain like that to children and make you understand exactly what she felt and how to deal with something, you know. If I would wake up with a terrible dream, I'd say, oh, Baba, she would say, oh, what's the matter with her? I had such a terrible dream. You had a terrible dream? What was it? So I would tell her the dream. She said, oh. My grandmother had this wonderful ability to turn anything that was negative, anything that was scary, frightening to a young person, a child, she would turn this thing around and it would become absolutely, totally, from her point of view, totally different from what I had envisioned when I woke up with this dream. And oh, it felt so good because then I could go on with my day and it was great. So, to this very day, I envy children who have the good fortune to have grandparents living with them. In my case, it was a grandmother.
And she was a very optimistic woman?
Yes, and it always amazed me when she came to this country, her sense of independence and not wanting to rely on her children for anything. She set up she had like a carriage, like a cart, because this is what she was accustomed to. This
in
was
Russia,
her
right?
way, yes, in Russia, it was her way of helping to support the whole family. And she went out and got some kind of stuff to sell, and she would put it on the cart and then wheel it to her favorite place where all the push carts would be, you know. And that's how she continued to provide for herself. This was after all the children got married, because before that she was the mother in the house, and they all went to work, and she did the housework, the cooking, the shopping, and the cleaning, and all of that. But once everyone got married, and my young, and Jack, my cousin, the orphan that she helped to raise until he was 6 years of age, when his father met a lady who was a widow.
This was Malka's son.
This was Malka's son, Jack. Jacob also, but Jack, they changed their name to Jack in English. And she wouldn't give him up. She had him, you know, until he was 6, and she was terrified that he should have a stepmother. But his father was a very wise man. He married a woman who had a child who was about 2 years older than Jack, maybe 8. And they had an agreement, no more children. He was determined, and he told her, the way you treat my son, that's how I will treat your son. She became mother to this boy. She was just wonderful to him. This was her son. But my grandmother didn't know this was going to be the case, and she wouldn't give him up. What? Give him to a stepmother? No. So he stayed with her until he was about 6 1/2. His father had already been married 6 months. At that time, my Uncle Charlie got married, and they convinced her that she just couldn't take care of this boy. It wasn't fair. She was getting older. He needed a father, and it just wasn't fair. His father was a young man, and you can't keep this child separated from his father. Give him a chance to see how he will like living there, you know. And so that was it. She was really forced to do it. With the agreement from the father that every weekend was devoted to his mother's family. So he would take turns. One weekend he would go to my Uncle Herschel's house. One weekend he would spend with us because at that time my grandmother was living with us. And one weekend he went to Uncle Charlie, and one weekend to Tante Cecil. And this is the way it was for years and years. And as he was growing up, he got so handsome. And my cousin Mildred and I used to fight over who was going to marry him. It was a constant struggle. Who was going to marry him? Of course, neither one of us did. But
And growing up, you and Mildred, my mother, were really good friends. During the years
of growing up,
Yes.
your mother and I?
Yes.
Oh, inseparable, inseparable. I can remember one great visit we paid to my Tante Cecil, who was, without a doubt, the best cook in the whole wide world. My grandmother too, excellent. My mother hated cooking, but I loved her cooking. She said she would rather clean a whole house rather than cook, but she cooked very well. But they were really, they were the kind of cooks that could have gone to the old-time Catskill Mountains, and then you knew you were getting Jewish cooking. So we used to go every once in a while, Mildred and I. They lived at the time in Borough Park, my Aunt Cyril and my uncle. And Jack was there too, he was still home. And she would prepare all the dishes that she knew we just loved, like knishes and, or what do you call those,
Blintzes.
not blend, well, she used to do that too, but no, it comes filled with either potatoes or meat.
Pierogi?
Pierogi, yeah, pierogies. That were out of this world. And of course she always had, you know, good meat dinner and everything, but these specialties, I can still remember. We used to go there from the time I was about 14 and living on the I was 15, living on the east side. Mildred would come down and meet me on the east side, and then we would take the subway into Borough Park.
Just the two of you?
Just the two of us. It was a visit to our aunt. And Jack was still home at the time.
Now, during those years when you and my mother were good friends and the families were growing up together, what was her relationship with her brothers like? I think you mentioned Jerry, but what about her relationship with Jack?
I can remember when we would be having dinner together, especially when they lived on 112th Street, and he would always seem very mean to her, always belittling her, poking, hitting, really talking down to her. Your grandfather would try very hard to make him stop this. And he did for a while, but then it would always surface. And there was always this feeling of almost dislike for your mother. That's my impression when they were growing up. When they lived with your mother, by that time, he was in college, of course, and coming home for dinner and going out on dates a lot, you know, so that he wasn't home that much.
Where did he go to college?
New York University, NYU.
And he studied education?
Yeah.
He always wanted to be a teacher?
Yeah. And so did Evelyn. They met there.
Oh, they met in college.
They met in college. And he still wasn't around that much. His attitude changed a little bit. Of course, you don't go poking, you don't go yelling and screaming or belittling too much when you're an adult already. But there was always that undertone. And one year, but I was already married then, we spent a whole year, a whole summer. The man I married had a sister who had a beautiful farm up in New Jersey. We spent that whole summer, and your mother and Toby joined me in that summer vacation. Your father would come out weekends, and he spent a week there once. And I was so pleasantly surprised. He came up, Jack and Evelyn and your father came up to visit Mildred and Toby. You know, Toby was only about a year and a half old. And his attitude, you know, was like an adult to another. But I never really felt that warmth between them. It was like he never thought that she was quite as good as he. He never liked your father. And living together didn't seem to increase his affection for him.
And how did he get along with his brother Jerry?
Again, don't forget something. There was a big difference in their age. When Jerry was born, he was already about 10. By the time Jerry was 8, he had graduated high school, he was off to college, although he lived at home, you know. So there is that big difference in age. It's like Greg and Beth, you know. She doesn't see quite as much of Greg anymore.
Yeah.
And she will soon be seeing less of him. And so that was the way that was. Even though he lived at home, he didn't go off, you know, to live on campus.
So as they were growing up as children in the tenements, they really didn't socialize together because of the age difference.
He and Jerry.
In the family unit, right?
Yeah.
And during those years, and maybe you could describe some of those memories that you have of the tenements and the years that led to the Depression.
Okay, well, living in the tenements was a very difficult thing for the immigrants who came over, because most of them came from much smaller areas that had lots of open countryside around them. And it was a very hard thing moving into the tenements. You could stretch your arm out of the window and touch the brick wall, right like this. The brick wall was right there. You could hardly tell if it was raining or the sun was shining because you couldn't see it. You had to get your head out the window and look all the way up into the sky to see if something, if the sun was shining, whatever. It was a very difficult time for the immigrants. And of course, working in the sweatshops, and many of them brought work home with them. So all the kids in the family were helping to work. Everybody was given a little job. When everything was finished being sewn, the oldest kid would have to bring it back to the sweatshop and get paid and bring it home, so that the whole family was actually involved in trying to make that living. It was very difficult, but they were wonderful to their families who were coming over. If they had to sleep on the floors, there was room for them until they could get settled into their own little tenement apartment. When When the Depression came, it was in 1929, I think it was in February 1929. I was still in junior high. That would have been my last year. It was a horror. My father came home from work during the day. I could still see his face. I could see my mother, the panic, the despair. His boss, he worked in Long Island City. His boss had jumped off the roof and killed himself, and that was going on a great deal. People were losing, when the stock market crashed and they had all their investments in the stock market, that was the end for them. I mean, their lives as they knew it stopped, and the terror was fierce, and that's how they ended it. They just tumbled right out of windows. Every day the newspapers were full of headlines, people doing that. We had no money in the bank, so we didn't have to worry. But I can remember your grandmother and your grandfather running, panicking, running. This I was told, I didn't see them do this, but I was told this, running to the bank for their money. It was too late, they couldn't get it. And so all their savings, whatever they had, went with that crash. They plus millions of other people. When we moved to the Bronx, my mother went on welfare because there was nothing else she could do. There was no way my father could get a job. People were being evicted. Right and left, they were being evicted. And at that time, the Communist Party became a political force. The young communists, the YCL, the Young Communist League, as people were, I saw this, as people would be evicted, they would be waiting. They would be there to carry the furniture right back into the apartments. So they became really very beloved by the general population because they were being helped by them. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected, and immediately the banks were, I forget the term that's used for that, when you close all the banks.
Run on the bank?
What? There were runs on all the banks. So he declared a holiday, a bank holiday, made all the banks close up because they couldn't allow this to continue. And actually, it was he that instituted the welfare to the people. They created the CCC camps, the civil conservation camps, in which young people were sent to forest areas to restore the forest and lumber, to cut down trees and build roads and minimum
So that
wage.
created jobs.
That created jobs. That was the whole idea. Soup kitchens were everywhere. Millions and millions of people were unemployed. It was a horror, just a horror. Your grandmother and your grandfather continued to live their lifestyle because, fortunately, your grandfather continued to work. And your grandmother, they just knew how to live much more frugally. I mean, there was not the kind of waste and throwing away of food and all the sodas and all the, ice cream. There was none of that. You had your breakfast, your lunch, your supper. If you were lucky, you had it. And many a time, I used to come home for lunch from school. This was even before the Depression. And what did I have for lunch? Mashed potatoes and sour cream, which I used to love. It wasn't until much later that I realized why I was getting mashed potatoes and sour cream for lunch. It's because my mother was beginning to run out of the money and had to wait for the paycheck. Potatoes were very cheap, also very healthy. My mother raised 3 pretty healthy kids. So that the whole lifestyle was totally different. But the impact of the Depression, which lasted until the Second World War began, it was a little less, there were a little more jobs available. I got a job through my uncle. I was very lucky to get that job because I was able to earn a fairly good salary because I was getting tips from the people who were drinking at the bar. I would cash their government checks. They were all working in the Empire State Building. Twice a month they got paid. Pay for a drink with a check, which I would cash, and they would always throw me $1. So that, I worked there for 8 years, and I never got a raise in 8 years. I made $15 a week, 6 days a week. Never had a vacation. The only vacation that I had in the summer was they gave me the Saturday off. So I had the weekend with which to do things.
And most of the people in the family were working at that point. The young people as well.
In my family, or in anybody else's family?
In the families, in your family, the other families, your grandmother's children.
My grandmother's children,
The grandchildren were all working.
well, my brother was too young at the time to go to work, although he did. He left school. We didn't even know it. Graduated junior high, and we didn't even know he wasn't going to school. I don't think he graduated junior high. He insists he did, but I don't think so. Because the truant officer came to the house. That's how we found out he wasn't going to school. And what was he doing? He was working around the corner in a model airplane factory. You know, they produced kits for the little model airplanes. And my brother airplanes was his life. And we found out that's what he was doing, and he never went back to school until I sent him for 1 whole year, for which I paid, to learn how to become an airplane mechanic. The end of that year, it wasn't even a year, he came to tell me he's leaving, and when I asked him why, he said he's been warned, he's heard it from several sources, that with a name like Harry Berg, he can forget about getting a job in that field. And he almost cried when he told me this.
Because of anti-Semitism?
Yeah. And so I felt, my God, I've been paying for this a whole year, Harry. And he said, well. And at that time, I met a man who was president of the Jewelry Workers Union. And I had a feeling that my brother would be wonderful at that because of all the patience he had making these model airplanes. And he was. He got him a job. $12 a week, started as a journeyman. As an apprentice in the casting department. And that apprenticeship lasted 4 years, at the end of which time he became a journeyman. So that because of me and my contacts, he got into a fairly decent trade.
You said the Depression lasted until the beginning of the war. How many members of the family went into World War II?
My brother that I know of, my Uncle Charlie's son, Marty, Tom DeSiegel's son was already too old for that. They weren't taking, or they took my brother, and he had a 1.5-year-old child. I'm wearing glasses, but they took him. Your Uncle Jerry. Your Uncle Jerry was very fortunate because all during the war he was stationed in Coney Island. And your father was living in Brighton Beach, in the Navy. Your Uncle
My
Jerry,
grandfather, yeah.
I mean, grandfather, your Uncle Jerry was in the Navy. But Jack was already like beyond that age, unless they would have been desperate, they would have started taking older people.
Yeah.
Some of my cousins on my father's side were taken. But Jack the doctor was already a doctor then and had 2 children, so he escaped it. I'm trying to think who else that you might know. I mean, in the immediate family. So those were the immediate.
And they all returned.
And they all returned, yes.
So the family was very lucky at that point.
Very, very lucky. When my Uncle Charlie and my Tante Mamie were beside themselves. I can't begin to tell you when they found out that their son would have to go. He was very young then, just graduated high school. And they were just beside themselves. But he came back, thank God. And so did my brother. My brother was injured. When they landed in Germany, he was injured immediately and hospitalized for about 2 months and then put back into action. He was a very lucky guy. He must have been very intelligent. They put him into the intelligence department. He could have been a millionaire. He was put in charge of black market, the black marketeers in Europe. He was in Paris, they sent him to Paris, and he could have bribed, or they wanted to bribe him so that he wouldn't expose them, but he would have none of that. He's true blue and fighting Hitler all the way. And the reason he came back before the end of the war is because my father was dying, and we got in touch with the Red Cross, and through that, he was returned before the war ended. Not that much sooner, about 6 months maybe.
And was Grandma Goldie still alive during World War II?
Yeah.
And how old was she when she died?
Wait a minute. Is she still alive? No.
No. How old was she when she died?
But she was up there in her 90s when she died. It was very sad because the last 2 or 3 years of her life, 2 years, my mother could not cope with her and my sick father anymore. And so Uncle Charlie went to my cousin, Jack the doctor, and asked for help. And he gave it very freely. Financial help and finding a place for my grandmother. And unfortunately, they didn't have the kind of nursing home facilities they have today. And it breaks my heart when I think of how she ended the last 2 years of her life. We all came, all the grandchildren would always come to see her, always, but it's terrible.
So she passed away of old age, or was she?
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah.
You know,
She lived a very long.
complications of old age. I think she had pneumonia, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, the lungs.
She lived a very long life.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She was way up in her 90s, which was amazing. We used to take her up on the roof. I have pictures of myself and my grandmother. I must find them and show them to you. And my sister and Nat took them, as a matter of fact, up on the roof. We always lived on the top floor. So she could always maneuver that one flight up.
So Goldie was the matriarch of a very large, very wonderful family that came here to this country and established themselves and went through all the experiences that you have told us about. And I guess the focus of this was really to understand about my family and my parents and their ancestors.